Thank you so much to our speakers, Scott Turow and Catherine Grace Katz. They will be joining us for a discussion of Catherine's new book, Daughters of Yalta, The Churchills, Roosevelts, and Harrimans, A Story of Love and War. Idea Salons are a new event from the Harvard Law School Library that provides students the opportunity to discuss their research and achievements with an audience of their peers and community. Catherine is an exceptional rising 2L, and we are thrilled to have the opportunity to host her in conversation with such an esteemed author. So, our remote moment definitely provides some new challenges. But one of the most exciting opportunities is the ability to facilitate conversations with people from all over the world. And today is a delightful example of just that. So, we may not have lunch today, but we do have the ability to invite new kinds of people to our community. So welcome back, Scott,
Thank you.
to a virtual space. So if you're a student and would like to be part of the HLSL Idea Series, please reach out to me at Jennie at jhalperin@law.harvard.edu. I'll put my email in the chat as well if you want to reach out. This session will end with a short question and answer period that I will facilitate. So if you have questions for either of the speakers, please type them into the designated Q&A box in the webinar. I will answer questions in the order in which they are received, but I may combine questions for clarity. So a little bit about our speakers. Catherine graduated magna cum laude from Harvard College in 2013 and received her MPhil in history from the other university in the other Cambridge. Her first book, Daughters of Yalta, was released by Houghton Mifflin Harcourt in September 2020 and has been called Skillful by the New York Times, Magnificent by esteemed author Julian Fellows, and Vivid by bestseller Eric Larson. Catherine will be joined in conversation and a reading by Scott Turow, JD78, bestselling author of Presumed Innocent, The Burden of Proof, and 1L, a book about his first year of law school. Author of 11 books of fiction and 3 books of nonfiction, his works have been translated into more than 40 languages and sold more than 30 million copies worldwide. Welcome, Catherine and Scott.
Thank you. Thanks, Jenny.
Thank you.
You know, I'm your comment about missing lunch reminded me. I was back at the law school a few years ago for the 40th anniversary of the publication of 1L, and we're lining up for dinner. It was you know, my friend Martha Minow and in Bagel to get us there, and one of the students, trying to be polite, asked me, you know, how the food compared to my time at Harvard Law School. And I told him with all honesty that during my time at Harvard Law School, they never fed us. A free meal on the law school was unthinkable. But anyway, so there have been big changes, and some things are the same. The student body at Harvard Law School is remarkably talented. And Catherine, even by those standards, is probably a standout. But her book is a wonderful book. It's propulsive. It's entertaining and deeply informative. So it's a great read. But let's start with a few deeper biographical details. Talk about you went from one Cambridge to the other, and what were you doing while you were a student at Cambridge?
Well, first I want to say thank you so much, Scott, for joining me today. It's a huge honor to do this conversation with you. And I remember reading 1L when I was applying to law school. I did not think that I would have an experience of writing a book during 1L myself. And I just remember reading your thoughts and just thinking how fun it would be to someday meet you. And so the chance to chat with you today for Harvard Law School it's so much fun. So thank you.
You're right. We are part of a relatively select group of people who've written books while being a first-year student at Harvard Law School. So we have that in common, as well as a bond in geography. We went to the same high school, half a century apart. But anyway, let's talk about what you were doing at Cambridge.
Yes, so in both Cambridges, history was a huge part of my life. I knew from the time I was a little kid that history would always be a large part of my life. I grew up watching movies like The Sound of Music and The Great Escape and White Christmas, and there was something about World War II that I always really found intriguing. My grandfather had been in the Navy during World War II, and I remember being a little kid and chasing him around at Thanksgiving with a legal pad, asking him to tell me his stories about his experience in the Navy. And so it's funny how these early life influences stay with you, and perhaps things stand out to you later in life because of the things that you remember as a child. I had been a history concentrator at Harvard as an undergrad, and very serendipitously ended up spending a lot of time learning about Winston Churchill, however, not Churchill during the Second World War. I was writing a thesis about British prisoner of war escape narratives, and I came to learn that Churchill had written what we would consider the first escape narrative of a nonfiction variety after his experience of escaping from a Boer POW camp during the Boer War in South Africa. And it was this tale of his thrilling escape, which really rocketed him to fame and launched his political career in Britain. And so when I went to the other Cambridge, again, to study history, I was doing a master's in European history. I was looking at the origins of modern counterintelligence practices during World War I, and did not realize Winston Churchill was hugely influential in this area as well during his tenure as Home Secretary. And so in both of my kind of scholarly endeavors to date, I had spent a lot of time learning about these different aspects of Winston Churchill's life and kind of seeing him from a different perspective as a young man. And I think maybe it was those influences that allowed me to see him in a slightly different way and consider other parts of his life beyond just his role as prime minister during World War II.
Right. Among other things, he was one of the great writers of prose of the 20th century. So, so explain the connection between your time at Cambridge and this book.
Yes. So when I was at Cambridge, as I mentioned, spent a lot of time studying Churchill at Churchill College at Cambridge. There is the Churchill Family Archive. And so I used that archive extensively in my research. After finishing my master's degree, I thought I should do what was probably many people in my same position would consider this the smart thing to do, the more kind of expected thing to do. I went to work in finance in New York. And while I was there working as a financial analyst, very coincidentally and serendipitously, in the lobby of my office was a bookstore called Chartwell Booksellers, which was named after Winston Churchill's country home. And this bookstore specialized in books by and about Winston Churchill. It's the kind of thing that probably only exists in New York. But I would go down and visit the bookstore multiple times a week. When I go get coffee, I got to know the owner. And before long, he suggested that I should meet the International Churchill Society, which is made up of scholars and professionals who want to encourage the study of history and to also encourage young people to go into public service, but also members of the Churchill family. And at this dinner, I met them, and shortly thereafter, I learned that they were opening Winston's middle daughter, Sarah's papers to outside researchers for the first time. And they were wondering if I would be interested in writing an article about them for their magazine. And of course, I said yes.
So, and that was that the beginning of what became this book?
Yes. So I had the chance to go back to the other Cambridge, back to the Churchill archives, where I had spent many happy hours the previous 2 years. And I, just became fascinated by Sarah's life. If people know her at all, it's as an actress. She was starred in a movie with Fred Astaire in 1951. And so people know her, it's in that capacity, but I had this other experience with her in a sense from the time I was a little kid, and kind of it came back to me in that moment when they asked me to do this article. I had gone to the big cloister at Sea Island in Georgia with my family every summer, and Sarah had eloped there in 1949 with her second husband, and there was this beautiful photograph of Sarah on the wall that I had walked past every summer since I was a little girl. And so I felt this very personal connection, that there was some sort of fate at work here. And as I came to learn more about her, first I thought maybe I could write a biography about her life. But what I found most intriguing was her wartime experience and the capabilities and intelligence that she had that I think have long gone underappreciated, especially in her role as her father's aide at both the Tehran Conference and the Yalta Conference. And it was because of her her value and her addition to her father and his delegation at Tehran that Averell Harriman and FDR were inspired to bring their daughters to Yalta in 1945 for the last meeting of the Big Three. And I thought that this was such a unique moment in history. And I couldn't believe that despite all the times I'd studied Yalta in school, I had no idea these women had been there.
All right. So I do want to go back to sort of the historical background of the Yalta Conference, but as long as you started talking about Sarah Churchill, who was not really a diplomat by training, right?
No, she was an actress by training. I think that of the various Churchill, of the Churchill children, I see more parallels between Sarah and her father than her other siblings. She was very determined, very stubborn. She wanted to make her own way in the world, but at that time, there were few opportunities open to women like Sarah to have a career. And the stage was one of the few places where she felt that she could have an independent life. And I do believe perhaps, if she'd been born 10 years later, she could have succeeded her father in politics because she had a very keen understanding of the political world, the feelings of a population. She was a beautiful writer and just had this natural instinct for it. And so it was such a delight to learn about her in this way, which is completely different than people who see, Sarah Churchill just as an actress.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that'll give us Sarah at the time of the Yalta Conference. She's what, about 30 years old?
Yes, she's 30 years old. She's in the women's branch of the Royal Air Force. She's an intelligence analyst. She knows the details of Allied operations just as well, if not better than her father, much to his great pride and amusement.
So we have Sarah Churchill, who's, and Winston first proposes that she will accompany him. And then let's talk next about Kathy Harriman and
Yes.
Explain a little bit about her father as well, since he's the figure least remembered today.
Least remembered, but one of the most influential people of the 20th century that many people today have never heard of. Some people remember Averell Harriman as a governor of New York, a wise man of the Cold War, and one-time presidential candidate. But before that, he was the chairman of Union Pacific Railroad, founder of the banking firm Brown Brothers Harriman, Newsweek magazine, various shipping and mining businesses, and also the founder of Sun Valley, the ski resort, which was something that he created to encourage people to use his trains to travel out west, and gave them a destination rivaling the glamorous resorts in Europe. And so it's also thanks to Averell Harriman and his engineers at Union Pacific that we have the first chairlift. So that's a fun little aside in history. So he was one of these incredibly wealthy people from the turn of the century in New York, but he was also very committed to public service and philanthropy.
Let me interrupt for 1 second. Not a self-made man, however, correct?
His father was a self-made man, but when his father died, Averell Harriman, through his mother, inherited the largest fortune ever inherited at that time.
Right.
But
So he had a little head start in life.
Yes, he did. But it didn't stop him from going out and working on the railroad with his engineers, and very much, one of these people who was committed to the welfare of his workers and very ahead of his time, both he and his father. And felt a real commitment to improving their lives and engaging in public service, which he did throughout the Roosevelt administration.
Right. So, all right. So we have Averell set. I remember him as challenging Adlai Stevenson in 1956 for the Democratic presidential nomination. And he's like a lot of people who were almost president, not forgotten, but certainly not as prominent a figure as he seemed to be at that time. But his daughter, Kathy, let's talk about her.
So Kathy Harriman, she was a remarkably adventurous and glamorous young woman who is one I think that many women today, in modern times, will really find a lot to admire, and also her life will resonate with them in many ways. She was an expert equestrian, a crack shot, an Olympic level skier. And she and her father were not especially close when she was a little girl because her parents had divorced when she was 10. But it was after her mother died when she was a teenager that her father really came back into her life And he was very ahead of his time in a sense in wanting his daughters to be as involved in his businesses as they wanted to be, partly inspired by the work of his sister, who was one of the top people in Roosevelt's New Deal administration, both Mary Harriman Rumsey and Frances Perkins kind of being the two women at the top. And so with this example of his sister, when Roosevelt tapped Harriman to become the Lend-Lease envoy in London before the Americans entered the war, Averill thought it would be a great experience for his daughter, Kathleen, who was just 23 at the time, to come with him in the middle of the Blitz to become a war reporter. And so she travels with him to London, and they spend the first 2.5 years of the war there, where they become very close friends with the Churchill family. And when he becomes the ambassador to the Soviet Union in 1943, she goes with him, learns Russian for both of them, and becomes the American woman who has more access to Stalin in his inner circle than any other American woman in history. So really remarkable young woman, and trying to think what that would be like to be my age. I started working on this when I was 27 years old, which was the same age Kathy was at Yalta, and just what would that be like to be her age in, on the forefront of history in one of these, more daunting places in the world.
All right. So now both Sarah Churchill and Kathy Harriman are sort of sparkling figures. And they make a remarkable contrast to Anna Roosevelt, who is 38 at the time of the, right?
Correct.
Unlike the other two, a mom, right?
Yes.
Three kids,
Mm-hmm.
married. Sarah had tried that, but failed. And so talk about Anna Roosevelt.
So Anna is in a position that no one would envy. And with Anna, I found my heart breaking for her so many times. She's 38, she's a mother of 3. She had been a newspaper editor with her husband in Seattle. They were the editors of the Seattle Post-Intelligencer. When her husband joins the army, she decides, rather than stay in Seattle, that she's going to move with her youngest child back to the White House. And once she moves back around, it's Christmas time, 1943, she notices something's not right about her father. He's staring off into space for long periods of time. He's sitting there with his mouth hanging open, and these are things that she didn't remember him doing before. She becomes very concerned about him and insists that he have a comprehensive medical examination, but no one else seems to have realized that something's not right about him. She thinks that her mother is in denial about this change in him. And so he does have a comprehensive examination, and it's revealed that he has congestive heart failure and he's very close to dying. And there's really no cure for this. The only thing that can be done is altering his day-to-day, his diet, his sleep, the amount of activity he does. But as president of the United States, this is just not realistic. And so Anna can't tell anyone what's happening to him. He doesn't even want to know. He asks nothing about his health. And so she's left to carry this burden alone, with only the doctor knowing what's wrong with him, trying to be the gatekeeper for him, trying to take on these roles of secretary and speechwriter and guardian, trying to decide who really needs an audience with him, who can meet with someone else, going so far as to take papers out of his inbox at night and distributing them to other people to try to save him. And while this is definitely not what she should be doing, she doesn't necessarily have the political experience to know who needs to meet with him, but she has these instincts and best interests as his daughter. And so she's carrying this horrible burden, and she's always wanted to join him on his overseas travels. Her brothers had been able to accompany him in the past as physical supporters, helping him stand, give speeches. And even though FDR doesn't ask what's wrong with him, he must have a sense that something has changed, because in January 1945, he writes to Winston Churchill and says, if you're thinking of bringing Sarah to another conference, I'm thinking of bringing my daughter Anna as well. So Anna goes with her father to Yalta, not being able to tell anyone this horrible secret, and she's doing everything she can to protect him, sometimes frustrating people along the way, and she can't tell them why. And so she's in a terrible position, and it's really heartbreaking to think, that she knows these are the last days she has with her father, and this is her last chance.
Yeah, you've talked a lot about Kathy and Anna's relationship with their respective fathers. You didn't say as much about Sarah's relationship with Winston.
Sarah and Winston were very close from the time she was a little girl. She felt that they always had a special connection, that she really understood the way his mind worked better than anyone except for perhaps her mother. And one of their favorite pastimes together was he enjoyed laying bricks as a form of relaxation, and Sarah was his assistant bricklayer. And so they would spend all these hours together in contemplative harmony out in the garden. And she loved to watch her father think. And after so many years throughout her childhood, they just developed this kind of natural understanding of each other. And sometimes Winston was kind of father and mother to her. In affairs of the heart, Clementine took somewhat of a distant role, really left it to Winston to reason with Sarah when she made what she thought was an ill-advised marriage. In the 1930s, she fell in love with the star of her show, and they eloped to America. And the trouble was that he was an Austrian citizen, and Winston was very concerned about the winds of change in Europe at the time. So they have a tense period there, but they really come back to each other when the war breaks out. Sarah's marriage is broken down very sadly at this point, and Sarah wants to make her father proud, joins the military, and he is incredibly proud of her, even going so far as to brag about her to Eleanor Roosevelt and reveal some military secrets in doing so. Eleanor Roosevelt leaks this to the press. Sarah gets hauled in before her superiors to ask, who told this? Did you leak this? And she said, no, I didn't. It was my father, just bragging about her, which is really quite sweet, because you don't think of Winston Churchill in this way. He loved his children very deeply, and Sarah was so much like him, and they had a wonderful relationship throughout their lives.
So we've sort of put the daughters, as the book does, in the foreground. But the backdrop historically is, of course, quite fascinating. For those people who know less about World War II than others, explain what the Yalta Conference was.
Yes. So the Yalta Conference is the last meeting of Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin. It's in February 1945. They don't know that this will be their last meeting, but FDR is very sick and he dies 8 weeks later. And so they are meeting together to lay the groundwork for peace in the post-war world. And there are four main issues that they're grappling with at this time. And the first is what to do with Germany after the war ends. Should it be allowed to remain one nation? They've instigated 2 world wars. Should they be broken up into smaller states in hopes that will keep them from being a belligerent in the future? The second issue is one that has kind of been in the background throughout the entire war. And this is the matter of Polish sovereignty. Britain went to war in defense of Polish sovereignty at the outset. And this is where they have a huge amount of tension with the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union has been invaded through Poland on multiple occasions, dating back to the Napoleonic era. They're determined to have friendly neighbors, as they call it, on their border, so they won't be invaded again. And they're determined to have a government in Poland that will be friendly to the interests of Moscow, so a communist government. And the trouble for Roosevelt, and especially Churchill, who is very close with the Polish leadership that's been in exile in London since the beginning of the war, is that the Soviet Union and the Red Army has boots on the ground across Poland and across Eastern Europe. And so this is the strongest point of tension between the Allies at this time. In the Pacific, Roosevelt has a great interest because he doesn't know at this point if the atomic bomb will work. He doesn't know if that's going to be an option. So he's looking at a potential ground invasion of the home islands that could lead to the deaths of 200,000 American soldiers. And he wants to do everything he can to save American lives. And to do this, he thinks he needs to bring the Soviet Union into the war in the Pacific. The Soviets and Japan had had a pact of neutrality throughout the war. And Roosevelt thinks that he can coax Stalin into making a commitment there in exchange for territorial concessions, which Stalin has his eye on. And finally, there's the matter of the formation of the United Nations. This Roosevelt cares about very, very deeply. He's determined to succeed where Woodrow Wilson failed at the end of World War I with the League of Nations. And not only does he see this as kind of a lasting testament to his attempts to secure peace, he wants to secure peace for at least 50 years in Europe, but he also sees it as a way to draw the Soviet Union into the international community in hopes that by drawing them in, he can supersede issues like local conflicts between the Soviet Union and Poland. And so these are kind of the four main issues. And at this time in the war, the balance of power has shifted. The British Empire is severely weakened. The United States knows this. Roosevelt's trying to form this bond with Stalin. He thinks that Stalin likes him personally. He knows that the Soviet Union will be much stronger in the future. And so he's hoping that this will be a breakthrough in American and Soviet relations. And Stalin knows that at this point in the war, given where his troops are, that his allies need him a lot more than he needs them. And so it's because of this power difference that he's able to force them to come to the Soviet Union to meet him rather than going to meet them in the West.
So I'm interested in the remark that they need him more than vice versa. But one thing I wanted to comment on, just we think of Russia as an Eastern European power, and culturally, it's pointed toward Europe. But the reality, of course, is that its ocean, its ocean side is actually on the Pacific, and that was what Roosevelt needed, was that presence in the Pacific that the Russians could provide, and it would be it would be unfortunate to lose that assistance. One of the we have Stalin, obviously one of, as we were to learn, probably second to Hitler as a mass murderer. Started the war, of course, in 1939 as Hitler's ally, and then was then changed sides as Hitler attacked Russia. But it seems, as you present things, that both Roosevelt and Churchill felt they could trust him. I forget, was Churchill, wasn't it not, who said that if he could sit down to dinner with Stalin once a week, everything would be okay?
Yes, he did say this. And I think both of them felt that they could work with Stalin like any other world leader. He could be a man of his word. I think there was a sense that if there was duplicity involved in dealing with the Soviet leadership, it was really coming from those surrounding Stalin and not Stalin himself. I think Churchill had a more nuanced view of this, things he said publicly to boost morale and to lend confidence to this somewhat uneasy alliance. I think he had a more skeptical view of Stalin than did Roosevelt, but Roosevelt is determined to make this personal connection with Stalin. He feels that there can be a breakthrough in international relations, if only just the two at the top can meet to hammer things out. He thinks that the State Department gets in the way of this, impedes this progress. He and Harry Hopkins joke about the State Department as being nannies and cookie pushers. That's a direct quote. And so he is wanting to meet with Stalin directly without going through the State Department, without anyone but his translator there to have these meetings, because he believes that, if Stalin likes him and respects him, then they can make a difference. Unfortunately, and this is something you see in the early writings of George Kennan, who is earlier in his career, he'd go on to become one of the significant figures during the Cold War, but at this time he's the number 2 person working with Averell Harriman at the embassy in Moscow. And before the conference, the Americans say, what information can you send us about the delegates from the Russian side that we're going to meet there? And he writes back and says, really nothing, because any useful information is probably fake. The only things that we know about them for sure are written in obituaries after they die, and they're of no use to anyone then. And that it really doesn't matter if the Soviets that you're meeting with like you personally, because even if they like you, they won't act contrary to their national interest. Maybe with the exception of Stalin, but Kennan is very skeptical about this. So, overtures, friendliness, invitations to rounds of golf, these are not things that will be effective in pursuing international political objectives when dealing with the Russians. And I think that this is something that's very true at the time and continues to be true today. And I think that this is kind of a lasting roadblock in the way that we think about approaching American-Russian relations. Subsequent administrations, even as recently as Bush, Obama, and the current Trump administration, have tried to make this personal connection with the Russian leader, and it just doesn't work. And so you can see this also from the perspective of someone like Anna, who can see her father so desperately trying to make this connection, and that it's just not sticking. And so maybe there's a reassessment of the last 75 years of our foreign policy stance that this can shed some light on.
So, ultimately, of course, Stalin proved anything but trustworthy. Ironically, the term that certainly dominated my childhood, in talking about US-Russian relations, the Iron Curtain, that was actually a coinage of Winston Churchill's, right? That
yes. He said this in a speech in Fulton, Missouri in 1946, where he's been invited to be a keynote speaker. Truman is there. It's a grand affair in this small town in Missouri, and it goes on to be one of the lasting phrases with us today.
Right. And so, you know, Churchill says there's an iron curtain falling across Europe. And he realizes that what is happening with Stalin's ambitions, which, you know, if you were to ask me before I had picked up your book, what happened at Yalta, my understanding always was, well, you know, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin got together and they sort of divided up Europe, post-war Europe. But that is far from what they thought they were doing. Is that right?
Yes, I think that they thought that they were coming together to pave a future where countries were more united through international organizations like the United Nations, rather than carving it up into spheres of influence. And you can even see the struggle in kind of the reality versus the aspiration through the communications of people who are working behind the scenes, like George Kennan, like Chip Bolin, who also goes on to be a great leader in the Cold War, but is there instead of as a Soviet expert, which he is one of about 6 at the State Department at this time. He's really only there to serve as Roosevelt's interpreter. And so there's communication between Kennan and Bolin saying, we're really not going to get anything out of this. We might as well just walk away and carve it up into spheres of influence now. And Bolin saying, well, you know, as the leading democracy in the world, we have an obligation to try to do better than that. And so it's you can see the struggle there and the wishful thinking and the sense that, you know, if only they can will it to be. And it just doesn't pan out that way as we now know. And so I kind of look at this period as we're, you know, reading about it now. You can see it kind of as a slow burning tragedy. You know that the writing is on the wall, and you can see how desperately they want it to be any other way. And they're willing to do anything to make it that, you know, better than they fear that it will be. But it just, realities on the ground being what they are, differences would have had to have been made in 42 and 43 to affect a different outcome in 45.
So the one of the charming things about your book, of course, is that both the realities of what was going on behind closed doors, to which the daughters were not frequently admitted, and their own perceptions are sort of intermixed. And I wondered if, in telling this story of this meeting, which was the physical setting, as you and I were talking about before we went online, is quite remarkable, sort of this rundown set of Romanov palaces, ridden with bed bugs and even problems with the plumbing. And even though Stalin was determined to do this in a splendid way, so that you had bed bugs on one side and these amazing meals, right?
Yes. The juxtapositions are everywhere between splendor and primitiveness and just the destruction of the war, but everything that's come before that in this region. This whole area of the Crimea, it's been at the crossroads of sparring empires for you know, more than 100 years. This is where the Crimean War took place. This is where you had the tragedy of the charge of the Light Brigade. It's just down the road from where they're meeting. There's a sense of almost that this place is cursed. I think they're meeting on the Black Sea. And that there's just I feel like the setting is almost a character in and of itself.
Right. And of course, Crimea, for reasons nobody completely fathoms, had been gifted by Khrushchev to the Ukrainians, and then forcibly taken back by our friend, Mr. Putin, only a few years ago.
Yeah.
But it is, it's also sort of the Russian resort area, right? The Crimean Sea. I wondered, in approaching this, you're focused on the 3 women. It's obviously a time when women are sequestered from power. And as you point out, perhaps even a decade later, Sarah Churchill might have been able to emerge as a political figure. Perhaps the same for Kathy Harriman. Did you think of this as feminist history? How did you regard that?
Well, I think I see it in some different ways. More than anything, I see this as a story about relationships and a story about relationships between fathers and daughters. But it is also an opportunity to view a moment in history that we think we know so well through a different lens that cuts across gender and generation. And I think that if you, to sum it up visually, there's a very famous photograph of the Yalta Conference and the big three sitting in chairs with their military leaders behind them, looking very worn and haggard at the end of this conference. One of the most famous pictures of the three of them, and one of the most famous of the war. But there's another photograph that was taken from a slightly different angle of the same scene, and you can see off to the side under the portico in this garden that the daughters are standing there off to the side, and it's just a slightly different framing, but it puts them in the picture. I think part of the problem is that we didn't have the sources available to tell their story, to really give the full picture of their involvement there until recently. As I mentioned, Sarah Churchill's papers were only just opened. I was the first person to go through them comprehensively. Kathleen Harriman just died in 2011, and when she passed away, her sons found a box of her letters in her apartment, letters to her sister from her time in London and Moscow. And they had no idea that these letters were there. She didn't talk about her experience during the war with them while they were growing up. Like many members of the greatest generation, very humble, didn't think that what they had done was important. Personally, they were just one person doing their bit. And so we didn't have the resources we needed to tell their story. However, I also think that while yes, women should have been involved in politics and foreign policy much earlier. These daughters, they don't have a seat at the table in the conference room, but I think there are different ways to think about power and influence and the roles that women have had that have given them power and influence in the past that is different than just sitting at the conference table. These three women have a very powerful role there in their capacity as daughter diplomats, where they're kind of quasi-official members of the delegation. They're not there speaking on behalf of their government, but they can go and talk to people and deliver subtle messages for their fathers and listen in and gather information, bring it back to their fathers. And so they're speaking not with the authority of government behind them, but with the authority of their fathers. And this is a very useful role to have in diplomacy, and one that's very, very powerful. And you can also, I also think that in each of our own lives, we have someone or multiple people who are the people that we turn to in moments where we need to discuss complicated matters, issues that are weighing on our conscience. And this is someone who's just invaluable to each of us. It's hard to say exactly what it is that they do that makes them so important, but we all know who this person is in our lives. And I see these daughters as being these people for their fathers. And for some of us, it's a mother, a sibling, a friend, and these are often unsung heroes, and we don't know their stories, but we all know how important they are to us. And so in a sense, I feel like this is an opportunity to bring that role, that importance of that person in our own lives to the fore, and to acknowledge them in a way that they deserve to be acknowledged for the impact that they have on all of our lives.
As you talk as a historian, I do, I want to ask you to just read a passage, just so people can get a flavor of the book. There's one detail I cannot avoid mentioning, which is the relationships between the Harrimans and the Churchills were a little complicated. And I want to mention this just so people understand that this is not a dry book at all, and that Pamela Churchill, who was Winston Churchill's daughter-in-law, married to his son Randolph, who drank even more than his father, which is an achievement. Pamela was also Kathy Harriman's best friend. She became her confidant during Kathy's years in London with her father when he was ambassador. And but in addition to being Kathy's best friend, Pamela was also Averil's lover, correct? Yes.
Yes.
And as it happens, both Anna and Sarah were, sort of the fifth business in their father's affairs. And I don't mean, I mean their romantic liaisons, which is, I think to a contemporary sensibility, both revolting and remarkable.
Yes. So Sarah, so Winston Churchill he did not have affairs. So Sarah, she was involved in covering up April Harriman's affair with her sister-in-law Pamela, but Winston was very devoted to Clementine, so we'll set him aside. But the other two fathers did involve their daughters, make them complicit in their affairs, and put them in a very terrible situation of having to either choose to cover it up and go along with it, or essentially be sent home. Kathleen Harriman, she is best friends with Pamela, and she moves to London, and she quickly realizes there's this affair going on between Pamela, who's 2 years younger than Kathleen, which makes it even more uncomfortable. April at this time is married to his second wife, Marie Norton Whitney, who Kathy is not especially close to, so she doesn't feel a sense of loyalty to her. And so she really sees it kind of, I can guarantee my place in London. I know that I won't be sent home, even if it gets more dangerous here during the Blitz, if I'm covering this affair, because I'm indispensable in this way. And so it kind of works for her that their relationship is really one that's more like business partners or colleagues and parent and child. So it's different. April Harriman is ahead of his time in some ways, but very much not in other ways. And then Anna Roosevelt is in a terrible position again. Her father had an affair with Lucy Mercer when Anna was a little girl. Eleanor found out about it, it's destroyed her, she's devastated. Anna only learned about this affair when she was a teenager. And then Lucy comes back into FDR's life during the war. And at this point, it's really more an emotional affair, historians think, rather than a physical one. But Anna knows that her father's dying. She knows that these moments with Lucy, just, in calm conversation, is one of the few moments where he can truly relax. And so she almost sees it as this compromise she's willing to make in hopes of saving his life. And this is, again, just a horrible position that she's in. And she kind of tries to distance herself from the situation as if she's not emotionally involved in this, as if it's just two other people. She's not a parent and child kind of thing. And so she separates herself as much as she can emotionally. And she's just in so many difficult positions throughout these years in the war. And she was the one that my heart broke most for. And she, these moments are both wonderful to write about because they are so complex, but also very challenging the closer you get to these characters.
Well, I promised that I was going to ask you to read, and I do want to do that. I know we also want to take some questions. So I will ask you to read. I want people to get a sense of the incredible fluency of the narrative and of your writing, which I think is really remarkable. And we'll see what questions there are out there afterwards. And if there aren't, I'll ask you a couple questions writer to writer, but why don't you read a bit?
Thank you. Well, that means a great deal coming from you, so I really appreciate that. I thought maybe I'd read a passage that kind of shed some light on the scenery and just this world into which that they have entered, where it is this glamour and splendor of the Tsar's former palace, but it's also this region that's been completely devastated, not just by the Nazis, but by the Soviet Union before that, during the Holodomor, the government-imposed famine in the Crimea, and just kind of what the situation is on the ground that they're experiencing as they're on their way to Yalta from where they've landed in the Crimea. Okay, so farms stood abandoned. Nearly all the buildings lay in scorched ruins along charred remains of trains, tanks, and other instruments of war, as if General Sherman had risen from the dead for an encore march to the sea halfway across the world. The only people the travelers saw as they rolled slowly southward were Soviet soldiers, many of them women and teenage girls, who stood at attention along the road every several hundred feet. It appeared that an entire infantry division had been pulled off the line to guard the route, though the presence of these careworn soldiers could hardly have been more than ceremonial. Few carried rifles. More striking than their gender or their lack of arms were their faces. The soldiers had been drawn from the many ethnic groups that made up the Soviet Union: Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Georgians, Armenians, Azerbaijanis, Uzbeks, Kazakhs, Chechens, and more. Each soldier, bundled in a long padded coat, was intended to be a nameless copy of the preceding soldier, an identical cog in the wheel of the state, but their faces betrayed individuality.
So it's a great passage. I was struck by it when I read it. But let's pause there and let the people who've been listening to us ask a few questions, and then when they've had their opportunity, I'll come back to that if there is time. But What questions do we have, Jennie? I can see the chat.
Yeah, so we have a number of questions about sources. I think we have a number of librarians on the call, so folks are asking about sources. Um, the questions, a question from Jocelyn as well as a question from Leah, which is, what were your sources of materials? Where did you start with papers? And what was your research aha moment?
Yes. So as I mentioned, this story started with Sarah, and it kind of moved daughter by daughter, because as I got to know Sarah, I became more fascinated with her time during the war, which led me to Kathleen and to Anna. And it was through the Churchill family that I was able to connect with Kathleen Harriman's family, and through them with Anna Roosevelt's family. So as I mentioned, Sarah's papers during the war, many of these were letters to her mother from this period, which are beautifully written. She made my job so easy. She's just a phenomenal writer. And some as well to her sister. The Churchill family also allowed me to access Mary Churchill, Sarah's younger sister's papers, early, before they were available broadly. So those were the main sources for Sarah. For Kathleen, as I mentioned, she left behind this huge box of letters to her sister and to her former governess from her time in London and Moscow, as well as appointment books, scrapbooks, things like that. And then Anna Roosevelt, her papers are at the FDR Presidential Library in Hyde Park, New York. She has letters to her husband and to her children. And there's also a small diary from her experience at Yalta. She had promised her father when she moved into the White House that she would not keep a diary, so that everything between them would remain confidential. And she had no interest in writing a post-war memoir expose of any kind. But she broke this rule of hers for the purposes of Yalta only, because she wanted to record all the smallest details of what she knew would be a significant moment in history, to be able to share them with her husband and children when she came home. And so these were some of the main sources, but I also had the opportunity to talk to their family and friends who knew them, close to this time or during this time, who are still alive today. Anna Roosevelt's children are in their 80s and 90s. Her daughter, Ellie, who I spoke to multiple times, she's a wonderful person. She was 18 at the time of Yalta and remembers this very clearly. She remembers her mother bringing home a little Russian doll figurine that Averil Harriman had actually given to Anna to take home to her children, as she still has this on her mantelpiece in her home. So I got to talk to her. I got to talk to Anna's son, who's a bit younger and was left behind at the White House and remembers her absence during this time. Also, Winston Churchill's secretary, Lady Jane Williams, she's still alive, and coincidentally, she's also the mother of the Archbishop of Canterbury. So she has had a fascinating perspective on history for more than half a century. Just a remarkable, kind woman. I got to talk to her at a small Polish restaurant in London that had been at the heart of the Polish government and exile community in London during World War II. So that was just thinking about the sense of place as a historian was also remarkable. And so it's the combination of personal testimony. I got to talk to Lady Avon, who was Clarissa Spencer Churchill. She was married to the Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden, and she was also Winston Churchill's niece, and she's 100. And so just these people who are still with us today, and it really was kind of this perfect moment of sources becoming available and people who knew them still being with us today.
So here's the question that I wanted to ask, and you've actually provided perfect entree to it in Jennie's question and the question of the librarian listeners. You talked about a vast array of sources. And yet the writer who's writing in the contemporary narrative style of what I'll call, without any attempt to be dismissive, of popular history, which is to say a narrative that is vivid to non-professional readers, and exemplified by the passage that you just read. How do you do that, right? How do you know what the soldiers looked like, what the wrecked military equipment at the roadside looked like? Where was that recorded? How much have you added? Did you go and sort of footnote yourself with every sentence, or had that scene created itself to you during the course of your research?
So I had a couple of people ask me, oh, how much of I'm enjoying reading your novel. How much of this is your own imagination? And the answer is none of it, because it's not a novel. It is all everything I say in it is taken from a source of someone who's there. If I say the wind was blowing from the east, it's because someone recorded that the wind was blowing from the east. Fortunately, a number of the people here were meticulous, obsessive writers who wrote with a ton of detail. So you have multiple views on the same scene, from just the daughters, the fathers, the military aides who were there, the many other members of the delegation, photographs, newsreel, oral histories. And so you kind of triangulating among the three delegations and the variety of perspectives that were there. There's also this sense that they knew they were living through something really important, so they took the time to record their memories. Another huge source of information is actually kind of through this figure who is not there, who is Pamela Churchill. She is the main correspondent that Kathleen Harriman has kind of at this time. She writes a very detailed, very long, continuous letter of her time there, knowing that Pamela is one of the few people who will know what this experience is like of being there. Pamela's not only having an affair with Averil Harriman, she was also having an affair with the head of the RAF, Peter Portal, although we don't know if this is more one that he's kind of imagined, that she has this soft spot for him, or if she really did, but they had a very, very close connection. And Fred Anderson on the American side. And so you have multiple people writing extremely detailed letters to show off to Pamela. So that's kind of one of those funny moments there. I think Kathy Harriman has been really overshadowed by the salaciousness of the affair between Averil and Pamela. So I'm really glad to be able to give Kathleen a chance to speak for herself in this book, because she is so fascinating and she is such an important person who we have for too long ignored in her own right. But in a scene like this, we have Sarah, the one that I read from. We have Sarah's views, we have Anna's views, we have the official conference reports. So you have photographs, you have newsreel that there is a U.S. Army Signal Corps that took B-reel footage for newsreel broadcast back at home that showed the scenery and the journey. And so you have many, many sources all commenting on the same experience. And to be able to draw on that wealth of sources gives me confidence as a historian that I'm portraying it in an accurate way, even if it is written in a more novelistic sense.
So 2 points about that. One, I'm not sure that we've mentioned that Pamela Churchill, who is an incredible figure, not only was Averil's lover, and the lover, as it turned out, of countless other men, described as a specialist in seeing the ceilings of hotel rooms throughout Europe. But she also eventually became Averil Harriman's wife. Yeah. And I guess Kathy's stepmother-in-law or stepmother. But what I was trying to get you to explain, Catherine, is you've absorbed all of this. I don't know if you've got note cards or files on your computer. I don't know how all of this is organized, but you do become the writer, right? Yes. You have to write the sentences. You have to choose the details. How do you do that? And because, as that paragraph clearly shows, it moves with such fluidity as a narrative. But how does that happen?
Early on in the process of writing this, I made the conscious decision that I wanted to write it as much from the first person perspective of the daughters as I could. We have many more, let's say, academic approaches to the Yalta Conference that focuses a lot more on the conversations happening in the conference room. And I think one of the reasons that we don't know the daughters as well as we should until now is that there's just, the conference itself is so dense that you could fill 1,000 pages just describing the plenary sessions among the big three, the military meetings, the foreign ministers meetings. And so I didn't want to dwell on that. I wanted to keep it focused on the things that the daughters were seeing and perceiving and being involved in. And so with that perspective, it helps to narrow what can be an overwhelming amount of information, the number of secondary sources that have been written about all of these people. There's a huge amount of primary sources, as I mentioned, but committing to a particular point of view helps to channel that information into a manageable lens through which to see it. and with the other perspectives around them can help to double check that what they're writing about is accurate, and also trying to stick as much to sources that were written in the moment rather than years later. It gives you a more of a sense of being on the ground and being kind of a fly on the wall, looking at the scene over their shoulder.
Well, I would say that you do a great job as a historian, and you're less able to reveal the mystery of the art and how you're able to do what you did in this book, which is just to take a massive amount of research, much of it from unique and largely uncelebrated viewpoints, and make not only a coherent narrative, but a narrative that, as in the passage you read, is so vivid and personal. And my hat is off to you.
Thank you. I think some of it comes from being an avid reader of novels. I read a lot of nonfiction, a lot of history, of course, but I read so much fiction. One of the reasons why I'm so excited to be able to talk to you is, because I don't think that nonfiction and fiction should, be kind of in two separate camps. I think that both fields inform each other, and writing and history there's some scientific kind of element to it. I do believe that there's a correct way all the information fits together, and it's kind of when you get stuck because you're wrong and you have to go back and do more research and figure out if this piece doesn't go here, it actually goes here, or it doesn't belong at all. But the history is a story. And that's something that I hope people can see through a story like this is you put these people on a pedestal, you have these summits at the heights of history, but at the end of the day, it's about people, it's about relationships. And I think that novels, do a better job than any other form of art of telling kind of the stories of humans. And so I am hoping that whether that people are kind of longtime World War II, Churchill, Roosevelt enthusiasts, or they maybe recently watched The Crown and thought this is an interesting period, I'd kind of like to learn more about these people. So there are different points of accessing the story, and it doesn't have to be intimidating. It doesn't have to be the summit in history, but it can be a story about fathers and daughters. It happens to be that they're, the president and the prime minister are the fathers and the ambassador, but they are to someone just dad. And that's something that we can all understand. And so I hope that it gives people confidence that they can understand these moments in history if they see them more from a human side, because these people really are human, just like anyone else.
Well, as I said, it's remarkably well done. We've reached the end of our time. I know from experience that people will peel off very, very quickly. So I want to thank everybody who listened to the two of us, and especially Catherine for being so forthcoming about everything that went into putting together this terrific book. So again, my hat's off to you. Congratulations, and thanks to everybody who listened.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you to the HLS Library. Thank you to all my friends and everyone who's joined today. So I hope you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed speaking today. And thank you so much, Scott, for taking the time to do this. I really, really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Have a great afternoon, everybody. Bye-bye.
And thank you to Catherine and Scott again. We can give them a virtual round of applause. Okay. Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Thank you, Jennie. Bye-bye.